Hello, and welcome to today's Integrating Doctrine and Diversity Speaker Series event. My name is Gregory Bowman. I serve as the Dean of Roger Williams University School of Law, and we're very excited to bring today's program to you. We hope you find it enjoyable, and even more importantly, we hope you find it educational. I'm going to turn the program over to my law school colleague, Nicole Dyslewski, in a minute, but first, I would like to start us off by reading our law school's land and labor acknowledgement. So as we begin our program today, I want to take a moment to reflect on the lands on which we reside. We are coming here from many places, and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of indigenous and native peoples who have been here since time immemorial, and to recognize that we must continue to build our solidarity and kinship with native peoples across the Americas and across the globe. Roger Williams University School of Law is located in Bristol, Rhode Island. And so we acknowledge and we honor the Narragansett and Pokanoket people, as well as Soams, the original name of the land on which our campus resides. We also acknowledge that this country would not exist if not for the free enslaved labor of Black people. And we recognize that the town of Bristol and the very land on which our campus resides have benefited significantly from the trade of enslaved people from Africa. The economy of New England, of Rhode Island, and more specifically of Bristol, was built from wealth generated through the triangle trade of human lives. During this time of ongoing national reckoning with our history of slavery and the disparate treatment of Black people, we honor the legacy of the African diaspora and the Black lives, knowledge, and skills stolen due to violence and white supremacy. And as we gather here today, the movement for justice and liberation is building in our country. Yet many are still being met with violence and even being killed, while others in our country actively work to stand in the way of progress. As upholders of justice, our hope is to become agents of change for members of our society who have been met with violence, physical, mental, emotional, through our privilege. And as upholders of justice, we believe that our students, who will soon be practitioners of law, can be and already are agents of change as well. So again, thank you for being here today with us. It's now my honor and privilege to turn the virtual podium over to Nicole Dyslewski, who serves as Professor of Law and Assistant Dean for Academic Innovation at Roger Williams University School of Law. Nicole, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. And it is my honor to also introduce Natasha. And I'm really excited about today. And because of that, I'm feeling a little goofy. So welcome everyone. I just returned from the Anti-Racist Development Institute's second annual convening, and I feel recharged, reconnected, and ready to uplift all who are doing the important work of anti-racism. Thank you for joining us today. I, of course, want to thank our continuing sponsors, RW Law, CUNY Law, Jurist, Berkeley Law, GW Law, and the Anti-Racist Development Institute. I also wanted to be mindful today and mention the elephant in the room, or in so many rooms right now. We are days away from the election, and so many of us are stressed and on edge. While today's session is not without import, I do hope you're able to tune out of some of the distracting election anxiety, engage in the conversation today with your full heart, and hopefully learning and engaging with Natasha's book helps sort of relax us all a little bit because of the amazing work she's doing. I want to thank today's speaker, Professor Natasha Varyani, who is the author of, right next to me, but a little hard to see on my screen, Owning Our Values, Understanding Systemic Racism Through the Lens of Property Law and Skills to Do Something About It. Welcome, Natasha, and let us get started with this conversation. Natasha, can you tell us a little bit about your identity, your professional path, and how you came to writing Owning Our Values?
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm particularly excited to be presenting in this series, which I have loved even before I've been a part of this institution. So I'm very grateful for you having me. So I wrote this book. It really is sort of the culmination of a lot of different parts of my identity. So I'm South Asian by heritage. My parents and sister immigrated to this country. I have always felt really important. I felt that being a lawyer has been a really important part of my identity, but I felt really lucky to have access to being a lawyer, to have access to education at all. So I have to admit, and I feel like it's something that really connects me to my students. I didn't put a lot of thought into my career when I was in law school. I was just trying to get through it. I was just trying to do my best and do the next thing. Get through my classes, do as well as I could. I didn't always do the things that I was supposed to do. And so I finished law school and I got a job, and it was in tax, which I loved because there was a policy connection there for me. But I really was someone who always felt a little bit like an outsider for a lot of different reasons in the law. And it has always brought me joy to feel like I could bring people in. So helping people to understand concepts that were complex and feel like, oh, that's not that complex. I get it now. I'm part of this club. It's not so bad, was something that really was important to me early in my career, in the middle of my career, and sort of late in my career in practice. And that happened when I was a tax lawyer, but it also was something that was important to me as I worked in affinity groups, making sure that, the face of the legal profession was changing. And then it occurred to me that that was something that I could do as a career to sort of help make accessible legal concepts. And had I been a little more thoughtful about my career when I was in law school, perhaps I would have prepared a little better and started writing earlier. But that's not how things went for me. So I made sort of a mid-career, really, I would say switch, but it was really just a restart for me. And so this work was really born, as so many things were for me, out of insecurity. When I made that switch from practice to academia, I was really nervous that everybody else in academia had been thinking about things and knowing things that I didn't know, that there was something that everybody else knew and I didn't. So I really immersed myself in sort of the language of learning and literature about educational psychology and sort of neuropsychology, about what it meant to learn in general, but what in particular it meant to learn the law. So those first years I spent in teaching law, I really felt immersed in both the doctrine that I was teaching and also the science of learning. And so that really informed some of the skills aspect that I integrated into the book. At the same time, I was really I continued to be passionate about sort of feeling like I came to the law for equity reasons, to make a difference in sort of public policy. This book, I started teaching property. Being a tax person, I think for me is really connected to concepts of property, to sort of figuring out what is yours. And when I looked up after a few years, I realized, oh, wait, not everyone really gave the same attention to sort of the science of learning the law that I did. And so I felt like, oh, maybe there's something that I can contribute. Maybe there's something different about the way that I'm teaching, certainly than the way that I learned the law, and maybe that is happening in some other classroom. So COVID happened, and it was a thing that really impacted everyone. And I became really thoughtful in a different way about sort of what it meant to engage students. And also during COVID was a time that we were thinking about sort of a racial reckoning in our country, as likely most everyone on this webinar knows. And during that time, I would teach online. And in the mornings, in the very early mornings, I would take my children out for walks around Boston. And often there would be sort of, trash around or sort of remnants of unrest in the Boston Common where we live. And I was processing a lot of what was going on in our country, and I was trying to process it and explain it to my children, who were also really thinking about, what's happening, and developmentally they were in a place where they were thinking about their place in the world and trying to understand what race and otherness meant. So thinking about how to explain sort of that racial reckoning to them and to my property class at the same time in this context of a global pandemic was really difficult. So I thought about this book, about writing sort of this sort of work to help support teachers and students who maybe are coming to law school to do something a little bit different with their degree and maybe feel like they're getting to law school and just marching through the curriculum about foxes and, views on Martha's Vineyard and all of these same things that I've been reading for many years. So I made a proposal for a book. And the very beginning of the book is a quote from Mari Matsuda, who is one of the founders of critical race theory. And it opens the book, and the quote is that love, friendship, community, and the struggle for justice matter. And increasingly, I see these all as the same thing. And I thought for me, that was a really important way to open the book. And that was the quote that was from her remarks at a conference. That was the one that I proposed, that I sort of vetted this book proposal at. And I'm really grateful for as sort of these academic conferences go, I was really grateful for that one. I got a lot of wonderful feedback from sort of colleagues on the proposal. And it was there that I really started to get the confidence that this was something that I could do. I went from feeling like maybe being a law professor was something that was inaccessible to me to feeling like, oh my goodness, maybe I can write a book. So I'm very grateful to have been on that path. And still in some ways feel like it's incredible that I was even able to publish a book. So that is a little bit about my path to writing the book. Mari Matsuda, who is one of the sort of founders of critical race theory, gave other remarks at that same conference. She wasn't there, but she gave them remotely because COVID. But one of her part of her remarks included the advice to sort of find a little piece of the mess that was going on in the world and work on it and write on it. And I really took that to heart. And that is sort of where this project was born and how I was inspired and sort of where it came from.
Thanks so much for sharing. One of the things you said, and I imagine that this also resonated with members of the audience. I was a real estate attorney, and the thing I loved the most was taking like a 300-page closing packet and explaining it in plain language. Like, oh, I can take these really complicated things and explain it to anybody and everybody several times a day, as it turns out. And I thought, well, geez, if that's my favorite part of the job, maybe I should think more about teaching. And that's how I ended up at law librarianship. The other thing that you said that I don't want to blow past is your own, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but the way you perceive yourself, because like I met you for 5 minutes and I was like, of course that person could write a book. And of course I want to read it as soon as it comes out. And I don't want to characterize it as self-doubt, but I do want to characterize it as like the difference sometimes between the way we see ourselves or our possibility and the way others see us. But I mean, it never crossed my mind that you couldn't and that it wouldn't be amazing. And then I read it, you did, and I read it and it was amazing. And I'm so glad you're here talking to us today. Can you talk about how the book is structured? One thing I thought was kind of unique is it started with a land and labor acknowledgement. But can you talk about how you chose to structure the book and how you see this as a book for professors and for students?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. First of all, I have so many students come through my classroom who I think are amazing, and I am so inspired by my students all the time, and I think that's sort of the same feeling that you're articulating. So it's a lovely thing to see amazing and inspiring things reflected in the people around you. So that's thank you for that. So the book is structured. I wrote a book that I hoped would be sort of useful and read. When I spoke to property professors, I found that there were a lot of them. Legal academia can be sort of a racially homogenous kind of group. In particular, sometimes the group that teaches property. And so when I spoke to property professors in different contexts, what I found was that there were a lot of them who really did want to think and talk about systemic racism in their classes and sort of uncover what it was and the ways in which property laws impacted or created or upheld these systems, but they felt that they couldn't for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons might have been that they felt like there was too much already to cover in their class because this is a heavily bar tested area. And there already were constraints on sort of the number of classes that they had and what they had to do already in the time that they had provided. And the other concern that I had heard from some of these professors was that they had a concern about their identity, right? And so that what they presented to their class might be sort of charged, and when it came sort of from outside of a book, or if they assigned an article, that it might be. So I think of this for me in my head. I think that my shorthand for this is voices and choices, right? Like the choices that we make fall really differently depending on sort of the source of what the source that it comes from, right? So I wrote this book to sort of address those two concerns. The structure of this book is that it comes in 9 chapters, each in an area that is a heavily bar tested area, right? To sort of help professors address that concern, right? And I also just have this feeling that particularly students who come to law school interested in social justice, and I believe in my experience that there are a lot of those who are interested in sort of what's going on in the world around them, whatever their sort of political affiliation. That when they are sort of engaged with these issues, they tend to retain the information a lot more. So that sort of concern about, oh, well, what about my bar tested subjects? I'm hopeful that this book will provide them sort of a source that is sort of well researched and trusted. And also attending to some of these sort of systemic concerns that will help uncover some of the social justice issues and engage students in a way that will help to address the what's going on in the world around us and help people understand and learn and retain and really care about the doctrine, right? I have had, people come into my class. One of my favorite things that happens is that sometimes people will come to me and say, I didn't think I cared about property, but it's actually not so bad. And I always say, I could have done without the actually in that sentence, but I'll take it, right? I love that it's something that is interesting to you, because when somebody comes to me and says, well, but what can I do? I'll say, run for the zoning board. There's a lot to be done there, right? There are a lot of sort of important jobs to be done that are connected to real property. So I hope that answers your question about sort of the structure. And then the skills piece is connected to some of the work that I did in sort of academic support and learning about learning. in the early part of my career.
Thanks. Just going off on something you said. One of the complaints I have heard from students is that whatever we choose to supplement the main text seems like an afterthought. If it was important, it would be in the textbook argument. And so I guess some people are concerned to supplement their main text because maybe it is students will see it as not as important, especially diversity content or social justice content is not as important because if it was, it would have been in the real textbook, What is your response to this, and how do you choose what to supplement the text with?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with sort of how I present it, my tone, presenting it in the class, right? This isn't the way I learned it, but I think it's really important. So I am bringing it in because I think it's important. The real answer to your question, though, when I first started to write this book, I wasn't intending to include cases in it. I wrote a couple of chapters and then I thought, well, I need to refer to the cases. And then it occurred to me, oh my God, I need to include cases in every chapter. And then it was really when I was about halfway through that I thought, oh my God, I need to write a case book. So in fact, that is the next project, is that I'm hopeful that I'm working on a project to write a new property case book that is like this, but expanded so that it's not a supplement, right? So that there is a new way to do this. And again, it sort of is a continuation of the voices and choices. But I do think that the classroom tone and presence is a big part of that, but choice of text is a big part of that too. Yeah, but it's difficult. I hear you.
Yeah, I struggle with it too. We use currently an OER resource. So like there is no main text, really everything is a supplement or everything is the main text. And I have like heard from students like, oh, if this was a real class, you'd have a real textbook. So we're in the process, the final stages of writing a textbook. But I struggle with that because of the costs of textbooks. So I don't know, there's a lot of issues like sort of specifically equity issues and social justice issues tied up in what seems like a very simple decision to supplement your book. But
sorry. Well, I have heard feedback from other people who have looked at this text and said, hey, I really love what you're doing here, but I'm committed to an open source classroom, right? I don't want any text in my class, right? So it's an interesting time. There's a really wide variance in the way that people are dealing with their texts. So that's maybe a different integrating doctrine and diversity topic.
Coming this spring. So digging into the book a bit, you state on page 25, continuing this practice of ignoring the rights of migrant workers in a first-year property classroom is a mistake. You then make some recommendations to readers about encouraging a healthy discussion about the relativity of property rights. I know for myself, there was no discussion of migrant workers in my property classroom. Can you share a bit about how you see the discussion about migrant workers and the relativity of property rights fitting into a 1L property class?
Yeah, so the migrant workers come up in a couple of different contexts throughout the semester in these cases because of the structure of, farmers and they are hiring migrant workers. And is it a leasehold? Is it not a leasehold? It comes up in a takings context. It comes up in sort of ownership. There's some classic cases that I will not geek out and name the cases, but it comes up for those of you who teach property, sort of that this framework happens a lot. I think for me, the more important thing is sort of uncovering this relative nature of property rights, that who you are matters with regard to sort of what your rights in property might be. And that's something that I think really your identity as a property professor really informs when you're in a classroom, right? So I think considering the ways in which, the different facets of your identity, different spaces, right? The way that I act in different spaces really changes the way I assert myself, right? And ultimately, that can become a part of our legal analysis, right? That's an important part. And I really want to encourage students to think about bringing their own set of experiences and identities into the classroom and incorporating that into their legal analysis, right? The two things that I say over and over again in my classroom and this book to my children in my life is that words matter because they do, but especially for lawyers, and that relationships are everything. And the second one is really, really important to me, sort of how we relate to one another, these dynamics that emerge and change based on sort of all of these power structures are fluid, and that when courts are interpreting our rights, they are interpreting these rights through the lenses of these dynamics. And so having sort of the ability to sort of read these sort of relational power structures and these relational dynamics is a really important thing. And I find that there are some students who may have more experience in navigating different kinds of power dynamics, particularly that may have different cultural power dynamics, different sort of gender dynamics. So they may be more well-versed in sort of code switching and navigating these dynamics, but I really want to encourage them to incorporate that into sort of their thinking, or being able to sort of identify where it exists in a legal analysis, in a court's analysis, or where it doesn't, and maybe it should, right? Because that's an important part of sort of maybe where the law should be going.
I think what you said is so obvious and also so brilliant, that your identity can impact your analysis. And I think like sometimes we present, whatever tool it is, on how to case brief, on how to think about analysis as neutral, when in fact, so much of what we're doing and how we think, what connections we make, what we relate to is dependent on our identity. So that so simple, but so amazing to consider, maybe why we haven't sort of spoken about that more often. My next question is, in the book, you discuss the Ozawa and Thind cases and the language about race and being technically Caucasian. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you fit that into a property class? How you handle what could be a very difficult conversation about race, and what the student reactions are to sort of that line of cases.
I'm so glad you asked this. I don't always assign it in a property class. And in fact, when I included it in this book, I got some questions from one of my external reviewers about what is this doing in here? This isn't a property case. This has nothing to do with property. And I really had to think about it. I really sort of sat with it for a while because it's a good point. These are immigration cases, right? They don't really have anything to do with property on their face. I've taught them every single time I teach my seminar on critical race theory. They're a really important part of what I do. But for me, they are connected with this concept of exclusion, which is really fundamental to a property concept, right? To being excluded is sort of one of the right to exclude is a stick in the bundle when we're thinking about property rights. So I had to sort of sit and think about why I was including this pair of cases. For those of you who don't know, who may not be familiar, Ozawa and Thind are a pair. I think of them as a set of cases that happened early in the 20th century. Mr. Ozawa was seeking to be a citizen of the United States. He was of Japanese descent, and the court said, no, this is a very broad simplification of these cases. The United States Supreme Court said, no, you have to be Caucasian. And then Bhagat Singh Thind came about a year later to the court and said, great, I'm from the Caucasus of Asia. I'm Caucasian. And the court in their analysis said, sure, but that's not what we meant, and you know it. And so it's really, for me, it's part of our history, right? And so to have this precedent from the United States Supreme Court saying, well, you know, your history is different, your language is different, you look different, we all have a common ancestor somewhere, but we know what we mean when we say Caucasian, and it's not you, is a really important part of thinking about the ways that we define whiteness, right? Which we don't talk about enough for a concept that is really embedded in a lot of the ways that throughout the 20th century, we found ways to exclude Black and brown people from rights in property by ways of redlining and zoning and all of these other things that we did. So for me, I sat with, I thought maybe there was a chance that I was including the Ozawa and Thind case because of my identity, because I am also South Asian, and so is Thind. I talked to people that I trust about it. I gave the chapter to a few more people to read and said, what do you think about this? And ultimately, because the person who gave me this feedback, the what is this doing in here feedback, was someone that I really trust and admire. And I decided to include it anyway. One of my favorite things to do in the classroom with Ozawa and Thind is to really ask students if they had ever heard of these cases before. And I find many students have never heard of this. They've never heard of these cases. Usually there's a couple that have maybe taken a constitutional law class somewhere in college or something. But for me, it's a really important thought to think about how the court roughly 100 years ago has articulated this sort of concept of, that's not what we meant and you know it, right? This sort of theory of exclusion, really, again, through the lens of immigration and not property law. But for me, it's an important foundation of these sort of relational dynamics. These are relative rights, right? And the relativity of these rights are connected to our identities, right? So for me, ultimately, I think that's important. And I think it empowers students to think more broadly in that way too. It's hard. It's difficult though.
What has student responses been?
Well, I haven't done it as much in property classes. Often it's very quiet in the lecture, and then I get sort of emails or office hour responses afterwards. Or it comes up, I have in a couple of situations gotten emails like years later. Right. So I think it's a slow burn. The thing is, I'm trying to sort of in the Ozawa and Thind and a lot of these cases, there's really nothing to do about it, right? Like I'm presenting this as sort of our history. There are times when I'm presenting sort of a critical perspective, and this is not one of them. Like this is the time that I'm really presenting these cases as they exist in our jurisprudence, in the history of our jurisprudence. And so there is just sort of right? A lot of times that's what it is, right? And then it sort of I receive sort of a shift in the air, I think is the best way to describe that.
I immediately was like, oh, we should be covering these in our race class. But my second response was, how wonderful would it be, scaffolding wise, if you covered this in property, and then by the time they get the next semester to the race class, that they'd be primed for for more of it. But I just loved that it was included in the book. Um, and then this section of the book ends with a note on alien land laws and recent Florida
Yep.
legislation. How do you, and this is a question that everyone always wants to know, how do you handle a very timely and potentially incendiary conversation in class? And I think one of the Q&As is, the theme is sort of the same. How do you, what advice do you have for those of us who are uh, committed to having these conversations, but also knowing that the chance that these conversations go wrong is very high, and there's always the moment when they're going wrong and you see it. What advice do you have to share?
Yeah, I mean, I always sort of think about this, and I think and talk a little bit about this concept of civil discourse, right? And I sort of set this, I think the tone that we set in our classrooms is more important than ever. We have more incendiary topics around us than I mean, I guess we've always had incendiary topics. It feels particularly dangerous right now. So sort of setting a tone of mutual respect is really, really important. But for me, not shying away from talking about these topics, finding a way to do it. One of the things I say to my students frequently is like, we need to find a way to talk about these topics. We need to find a way to have a civil discourse, because if we can't do it here, then I don't know where we're going to do it. If a law school classroom is not where we can find a way to have sort of an informed disagreement that is rational, then I'm not sure where else that is going to happen in our world. And so I feel like having to say that and sort of putting that sort of responsibility on all of us together helps. Setting that baseline of sort of making sure that we're all using language that helps. I've stepped in as I have sort of stopped students before. I have rephrased. I have asked students to rephrase, right? There's no general advice I can give really, because every moment requires its own has its own specific need, right? It requires a lot of discretion, and I ask students often to have grace with themselves and one another. Courage and grace are sort of two things that I have often asked of students. I don't think there is any general advice here. I mean, I do think that it is something that requires practice and patience, but there are no easy answers here. It's worth it's work worth doing, though.
Right. I think that's the advice, that it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for all of us. We're all going to have those moments, but this is our truth, right? Like, this is the truth of our history. This is the truth of American law. This is the truth. This stuff is happening. I also lean into the grace part, and I don't usually go for the talk about civil discourse. Because I feel like with my own identity, asking for civility might seem as like shushing people or harming people, but I think, like, it's so much easier to not do this work. But to your point, I think the best advice you're giving is that you just keep doing it. Like, you just keep doing it, and then you wrote a book to help the rest of us figure it out. In property law.
I do want to acknowledge, though, that it's really uncomfortable, right? Like, I'm not coming from a place of someone for whom this has not gone terribly wrong, right? Like, it has. And
That's the real question I have. Like,
yeah.
and you're right. I mean, there's no answer, but I have been up there in the classroom and I have seen like the train going off the rails and the pit in your stomach of it is my responsibility to be the adult in the room. It is my responsibility. And lucky for me, because of my whiteness, it's usually not harmful for the way that it could be for someone who isn't white. But I can't imagine doing it when it's also sort of personally an attack on your own identity, but it's just really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't have advice. I find myself, I know I'm naturally someone who is nurturing and likes everyone around me to be comfortable. But I find that in these spaces, that's not, I can't do that, right? That's not that I'm owning sort of the discomfort, right? And that's better for me. I think it's worth that, right? That what we get in the long run is worth that discomfort.
And I think that owning the discomfort is amazing advice. Thank you. Um, Getting back to the book. Oh, another section of the book I really liked was the discussion on page 44 about traditional Native Alaskan systems of land use. Something again I don't remember from my own property law class. Can you share about how you work this into your class? And also, do you talk about like this the stewardship aspect when you discuss when you have similar discussions in wills, trusts, and estates?
So this was the part that I was almost gonna, I told you that I was gonna say, I don't know if I should ask you to ask this quite this way because I don't do a good job talking about this in wills, trusts, and estates. I do talk about sort of this is again, sort of thinking about different concepts of ownership. There's an indigenous sort of, not everyone thinks about ownership the way that we do here in our sort of American legal system, our common law legal system, and the indigenous belief with we don't think about land and ownership the same way. And that has an impact on our adverse possession statute, which really requires somebody take possession of something adversely, right? There's an adverse and hostile standard that's built into the law that will disadvantage people. I don't talk about it as much in my wills class, but I will say that this is, I'm on a path too. I decided to sort of own this question to let you know that my work is also ongoing, right? I'm still, in fact, we were just in wills class. I think there might be a couple of people from my wills class here. I was sharing with them that I'm doing, I did cite some work from Robin Wall Kimmerer in the book, but I'm continuing to read some of her work. And we were just talking about sort of the importance of punctuation and pronouns in the way that it can impact the interpretation of wills. And I was thinking about Robin Wall Kimmerer's work when she suggested a new pronoun for nature. She suggested using ki and kin for nature, and I thought that was really nice. And I shared that with my wills class, and that's not really a substantive suggestion. I don't do it enough in wills. And I just wanted to normalize that I just wrote a book on this subject in property, and I'm still working on it in my other classes, right? And it is always going to be a work in progress for me. And I hope that that's the case for everyone. I hope that it's never not a work in progress. So that's where I'm going to land. But I do cover it in adverse possession. But I do think we should always be thinking about sort of the different ways, not just with indigenous sort of perceptions of property, but also the different sort of cultural things that we bring to the ideas of family and inheritance and who's going to take care of older people and how that impacts our rights to our personal property and our real property.
Thanks. And thanks for being vulnerable and honest. So this is not really a question, but a comment. On page 123, you stated, the job of lawyers is distinct from all other disciplines. In a common law system, we rely on precedent. For decades, the Mortgages and securities have been taught and learned not as fully accounted for their complicated history, that is, how they have shaped not only the country's economy, but also the values that are imprinted in our legal system. Only by unforgetting this history and embedding it in our learning can we do better moving forward. So I threw my book, I cheered out loud. I was like, yes, yes, this is it. But my real question is, in order to add nuance to some of these topics, especially around systemic racism, it takes up class time. And I actually heard the same question asked at another conference. What can we stop teaching? Can we stop teaching about fox hunts? Can we stop teaching about rich people things? Can we stop teaching about old-timey things? Can we stop teaching and make some room in the curriculum for these nuanced discussions? Um, uh, some professors, specifically newer professors or more vulnerable professors or pre-tenure professors, are hesitant to stop teaching the old chestnuts. But can you, what say you? Can you give us some permission to let go of some things?
Yeah, I give permission to sort of let go of some things, but I also want to encourage you to do so thoughtfully. So, for instance, I know about the fox, right? That is likely one of the chestnuts that is written in like the most opaque kind of language and like the most inaccessible case that you can imagine. But I have to admit, I love the fox case. Like I love it. I'm the most dorky property professor in the world in that way, and not because I do sort of also I'm not in love with the way with the language in which it's written. I do believe that it's inaccessible to sort of the modern student. The reason I love that case is because of everything that's underneath that case, right? There's a law review article called "It's Not About the Fox," right? There are dynamics about who is the old money and who is the new money. And so I think being thoughtful about sort of, well, why is this part of the precedent? And is there a different way that we can learn this? And I think I think that we mentioned environmental justice and nuisance for me is like one of the ways. Look, we can learn nuisance law. We don't have to talk about, people's houses on Martha's Vineyard and their views, right? Like there are a lot of people who experience nuisance through real, very difficult problems, and through air quality and through sort of they get sick because of their proximity to toxic waste and a lot of different things. So I think for me, just being really thoughtful. Why is something an old chestnut? Is there something here that is worth me hanging on to? And if not, what is the thing that I can connect to that will help me to teach teach this concept? I'm really student centered, right? What is the thing that is going to help me to get this student to understand this concept and to keep it, right? I had someone a long time ago, a high school biology teacher who told me that what you learn with love, you never forget, right? So having said that, in the same sentence, I am going to tell you something radical about my teaching. I go into the classroom assuming that students are going to forget the vast majority of what I tell them, right? They're not going to remember these concepts. And in fact, that's fine. They're going to look up in their careers, they're going to look up the law. What I want them to remember about my classroom is the feeling of being sort of free to be intellectually curious, to be sort of challenging of their assumptions, to be thinking sort of new things or seeing things from a different perspective, or in some way that's unexpected, and to sort of make a habit of that. That's what I'm trying to do, sort of to build a habit of that sort of novel way of thinking.
Thank you. We have some questions in the Q&A. I think there are kind of two that go together, so I'm going to start with those, but if you want to review them yourself. One is the anti-canon is important to know, but how do you encourage students to actually read? Students openly admit that they do not read for class. And then to go along with this, there are short videos about race that help introduce discussion. For example, the Color of Law summary video. Any thoughts on using intro videos or creating one to go along with your book if you haven't already done so? So I guess, how do you convince people to read, and what about all these other types of media?
I show the segregated by design video. It's 17 minutes. I don't assign it. I find that there is something important about watching it together, that communal watching. I think there is something about that. So we watch that's the Color of Law video. So I have sort of thought a little bit about putting together sort of video modules. Just very recently, somebody asked me about that, and I thought, oh, that could be interesting for my class. How do we encourage reading? I generally, again, I feel very student focused, right? I try very hard to sort of think about where my students are coming from. But I also try to think about sort of preparing them for where they're going. And I find that a lot of my students are, they have a lot of agency, right? They're very, they make good choices for themselves. Many of them are interested in, if I give them things that if I give them the right tools, they are likely to use them, right? So I feel like if I put a lot of thought into the assignment, that they will read, and if I scaffold it well in class, that they will read. I don't have an answer to this. I'm sure I have a lot of students who, use my syllabus and assignments in ways that I don't particularly intend, and maybe in some ways it's better or worse. I don't always think I know. But yes, I have thought about videos. I hope that's something that I can do when I don't know. I do want to shout out, since I was just talking about environmental justice, I want to shout out, can I shout out something that I am hoping to do in the next semester? And I think will be really exciting. I read a book about environmental justice. It's called Advocate, and the tagline is a graphic memoir of family, community, and the fight for environmental justice. It's by a lawyer named Eddie Ahn, who went to Brown in Rhode Island, but now he runs a nonprofit in San Francisco. And I loved it so much, and it is so connected to so many of the concepts in owning our values that I reached out to him. And now I think he might come visit my property class in the spring. So, I mean, things like that are ways that I can think about connecting these concepts of environmental justice and nuisance, for instance, that I hope will stick, right, and help students to see things a little bit different. So I just wanted to say that too, to close out my last answer.
You jumped on it before I could, but I really like a variety of media. I love the uptick in graphic novels is the wrong word. Graphic textbooks, graphic nonfiction. Particularly around race and areas of social justice. We used the graphic version of the Race to Incarcerate in our race class this year. I think using videos, using documentaries, using podcasts, really helps connect students beyond just the casebook. And so I love that you're using a graphic book. And I'm really excited. I also think bringing in speakers is another way. And I think that one of the things that I think your book makes clear is the students are really interested in this already. You're not suggesting that we add content that's, not relevant or not interesting. You're adding content because there are already students who are begging for it. And to the point, one of our own students left a comment that said race is inextricably linked to the foundation of law, and it should be prominently highlighted from the outset and discussed in all of the 1L doctrinal classes. Race shouldn't just be relegated to the race and foundation course, which I 100% agree with. But I think our students are begging for this content. The other thing I wanted to say is your book is about property law. Are there any plans for you to write a similar book for other areas that you teach, or convince other scholars to write owning our values for other doctrinal areas? I thought that this book is interesting, but this book could be an amazing series. Have you given that any thought?
Yeah, I was sort of on the fence. I think my next project is going to be sort of the full textbook for property, since it feels like I'm on that path. But yeah, it certainly could be a first year classroom series. I'm obviously not qualified to write the whole series. You just came from the anti-racist conference. I also just came from a conference that was also inspiring. It was the American Tax Policy Institute. And so tax is not a first year class, but I think there's also room in some core upper level classes like tax, like business organizations, which is another class that I'm teaching this year. I am particularly interested in thinking about social justice in those places where people don't necessarily think that it exists, like business organizations, like tax. And when I teach my seminar on critical race theory, I focus on these areas, right? I'm not an expert in criminal law. I'm not an expert in immigration. But when I can sort of focus on these areas, and I know there's more than enough critical race theory in these areas to fill up an entire semester. And when I can do that, I feel like it's a powerful thing, right? And so for me, I'm particularly interested in, so yes to the first year classes, yes, and also classes like biz orgs and tax and wills, things like that are not in the first year curriculum, that are nevertheless really important parts of the core curriculum for me. I don't know when I'm going to do it. I don't know who's going to do it. I don't know when I'm going to do it, but I will shout it from the rooftops, and I can certainly suggest content. So if you're on this webinar and you want to write that book and you need some suggestions, I will be happy to make them.
I mean, I want to throw the gauntlet down to Carolina Academic Press and say, this was amazing, keep going. And, the work can be hard, but it's that much easier when you have an amazing book to rely on, which it makes it easier for your students, and it makes it easier for the professors. Sorry, you can respond however you choose, but can you also share the name of the graphic book about environmental law again?
It is Advocate by Eddie Ahn, AHN. Sorry about that. I just threw that at you. And also, yes to Carolina Academic Press. And I will just sort of give you this disclaimer, though. I taught property for about a decade, right? It was a decade's worth of work that finally culminated in me being able to sort of putting together materials, supplements and slides and exercises and all of these things. It was a decade's worth of work that culminated in owning our values, right? I've been teaching wills for, I think, about 5 years now. So maybe in another 5 years, I'll have the wills text. But I don't know. I don't know. Can I mention one other book that has been sort of on my mind and inspiring me? I know we have, because we only have 2 more minutes.
No, please, the time is yours. Also, so many of us are librarians. Yes, we want to talk about books all the time.
I know you were going to ask about it, but in Owning Our Values, I cite the work of Deborah Archer, who cites the work. This is a tome. You're thinking about other media, but this is like the anti book. This is a book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro. It's about Robert Moses, and it's celebrating its 50th anniversary right now. This book was written 50 years ago. And it is about how one person, because property rights are relative and power dynamics are real, can shape through using takings and zoning and all of these tools of property law can really ruin a lot of people's lives. And so it's a really fascinating meditation on property. And Robert Caro, the author of this book, is sort of an incredible researcher. And so I highly recommend that. And if you don't feel like you want to read the entire tome of this book, because it's celebrating its 50th anniversary, there are a lot of podcasts that are celebrating it. I have been listening to the 99% Invisible book club of The Power Broker, which I've been enjoying on my drives to Roger Williams. So I recommend that for those property nerds out there.
And what is like the nerdiest thing? Like last year, I asked for that book for my birthday. I went to Hofstra undergrad, and so many of the decisions that are discussed in that book are so personal to people who live in and around New York City, specifically Long Island. And so that you covered it in your book, and it also talked about some things related to urban planning and gentrification, and it was really enriching in a way that I became really excited to learn more. And maybe I'm not your test audience because I'm not a student in your class, but the book made me want to keep reading. It made me want to listen to podcasts and keep learning. And that's the best thing I can say about a book, which is I found myself in there. I cheered, I cried, I wanted to keep reading. Do you have any final words?
No, I just, there was a sign at my son's old preschool, which he doesn't go to anymore, that I was trying to look for the exact quote and I couldn't find it, but it was something about how sort of the purest form of love is attention, right? And I think that that's especially true today when we have so many different kinds of demands on our attention. So I really wanted to end with gratitude. When I was writing this book, it never really occurred to me that people would actually read it. And I know that sounds sort of Pollyanna, but I'm so grateful that people are engaging with it. I'm so grateful to you for hosting me here, for everyone, for attending, for listening, because really in this time when there are so many inputs for us, I do really feel like your attention is a form of love, and I'm really, really grateful for it. So that is how I want to part.
And I want to part by asking you to come back, and we should do a whole one on Robert Moses, because that's exciting. But thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable and being honest. Not only thank you for writing the book, but being willing to come and talk about it in the middle of your semester while you're grading midterms and approaching the election. Integrating Doctrine and Diversity is back on Wednesday, November 6th at 1 p.m. Echoes of Slavery, a deep dive into the Citing Slavery Project. See you all then, and please reach out if anyone has any questions or wants to invite Natasha to your class, because it seems like we have a bunch of invitations in the Q&A. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.